Hi everyone, welcome to our final chapter for international marketing. Chapter 19, Negotiations. So as always, this section is a bit of an introduction with a few activities, a few key terms, and all that good stuff. So speaking of which, some big ideas and objectives for this section. Number one, culture matters with negotiations, and ethnocentrism will kill your negotiations. So it's important to practice researching and recognizing cultural differences when it comes to negotiations. So things like language, nonverbal behaviors, values, and thinking and decision-making practices. Next, negotiation styles are flexible though, a mix of cultures. So you want to be able to explain how individuals can use different negotiation styles, explain how different cultures may interact with each other to affect negotiation styles, and to explain important ways to design and promote a good functioning negotiating team. Finally, cultural context and relationship marketing is more likely to be important for international negotiations. So you'll want to be able to explain why you will need to approach and apply high cultural context styles in negotiations. So the importance of norms and actions within the situation. So you can see the book's learning objectives mirror the same considerations. Number one being things like culture is super important to consider during negotiations. Don't use stereotypes, be respectful. Next, there are key factors particular to international negotiations, and you need to consider the ways things like norms, values, etc. will impact things, especially in regards to that communication here. Then the book wraps up by turning to building and managing you as a negotiator, but also managing your negotiations team itself. So the activity that we'll be covering in class over the next couple of weeks is the negotiations workshop. So you'll get a scenario handout, everyone gets the same one, but then each team gets their own profile. I'll assign you to the Blackboard group during class, and then we'll study up on your organization, the country you'll represent during the session. The goal, best deal between the pair of you, since there's going to be more than, there's not just going to be 2 groups, it's going to be more like 4 groups or 6 groups. So a major activity we want to consider is, well, what could an action mean? Let's talk about extreme things can get first. So imagine the setting. An American semiconductor team selling to a Korean buyer team, and this has happened many, many years ago. The US company had experience with this old school group before, although not this team itself. And they're new, they're a little new at this, but that's okay. They know this buyer. That should be good, right? But here's what happens. The chair cartwheeled through the air, impaling itself into the wall, all 4 legs at equal depth. This was thrown by the new early 30s up-and-coming business manager of the Korean contingent. "We're done," said the US seller team, but then a fatal hesitation, as authors Requejo and Graham put it, as the senior member from the Korean team apologized and invited them back to the table. Well, what happened? The book reveals that the up-and-comer who threw that chair had a great deal of US educational and business experience. And in fact, this outburst was planned. The distraction did exactly what it needed to. The American team, already off balance because they lacked international experience and experience with their fellow US teammates, now were not in the headspace they needed, and effectively made quite a few concessions now. So if you want to hear more stories, I highly recommend that book by Requejo and Graham. It's called Global Negotiation, The New Rules. A fun read. But what does an action mean? So that one was a very extreme case. But actions aren't always so dramatic and pre-planned. So what could it mean when you hear or see a long pause? One of the negotiating team members whispers to another, or seems to be reading or typing a chat note. What if you find they want to postpone the meeting to go out to see a local sports game with you? What if they don't seem to want to settle on a point and then move on? They keep bringing up this other point. So, now just what does this mean? Well, what could it mean? I invite you to sit down and think of how each of these could mean effectively more than one thing. And you probably have a sense of why you think certain ideas are more likely than others. But then, how do you know? What do you know? And now I especially invite you to flip this idea. What happens when you are doing any of these things? Not everything is something combative or manipulative or even intentional. So be aware and observant. Remember to think people. Sometimes actions are strategic, but sometimes all of you are just fellow people, a mix of individual quirks and cultural practices. So while we started with a pretty extreme example of a very carefully considered plan with someone bringing in all their cultural experience and using it to help their negotiating team, oftentimes we get situations where we're all just people, and sometimes there's lots of reasons why something might happen. So something to consider next is your own negotiation style. So here are 4 big categories. So conflict avoidance. So some people are just really conflict avoidant, where they don't want to make waves. They don't want to cause disturbance. Some are extremely competitive. As long as I win, perhaps. There's also consensus, where as long as everyone agrees. And then there's, finally, collaborative. The idea of problem solving and doing a win-win. So what type do you think you are? So for some of you likely know that you may tend toward a particular one all the time, or you at least try to go for a certain one all the time. But then some of you might go, but sometimes it may depend on what the person is or what the situation is. And negotiations, some of you are probably going, but professor, I've never been in negotiations. Maybe, maybe some, but you have. Think of all the times that, say, you're in class discussing with your classmates on who does what, or you're talking to me, or you're talking to someone else. That, in effect, is a negotiation because we're working together. It's collaborative problem solving. So what you'll see is that negotiation styles can vary in lots of ways. So you'll see negotiators may have a preferred style, but many can use more than one, and many of you, in fact, do use more than one. And it may depend on what they think it will best work for you. So someone who normally would be a collaborative person knows that, this group, you need to show a show of force to show that, and then before they go, okay, you're cool, and then they'll do collaborative. So there might be a lot of play with that. And then, of course, how they manifest will vary by many cultures. So there's lots of cultures involved that it isn't just, I know that they are part of the Brazilian culture, or I know they're a part of the South African business culture. You can't assume that. There's a whole mix of different elements involved. So think back to that building bridges activity. What can you take from that? So some examples that you might consider, and I know some of it did not completely come through because we were on Zoom after all, but high cultural context, things like body language and other norms as part of the situation will matter more. And not disagreeing. We just like to listen and silences are normal, or we need time to get to know you. All that matters. And as you can imagine, the Zoom context itself is a thing, capital T. You gotta think the whole relationship. What is your intent? What is going on? you need to think big in terms of exchange. So a lot of you, of course, started with the product, but a lot of you were going, what can we do about time, space, and action or object, ideas, knowledge? And of course, what about incentives and value? What do you have to offer? What pressures are they dealing with? What can you help them with? And above all, the power of listening. So what are some issues you may face? And of course, this is a bit of a laugh and an understatement in our Zoom days, but we know that at our root, it's figuring out and addressing needs and communication barriers, decision-making styles, lack of support from your home office, leverage that one group may have, time and resource pressures, needs, and changes, updates, how fast things are changing. All of these will complicate or perhaps help us figuring out and addressing the needs of us and our partners, or potential partners at least. So that brings us back to you. Well, what kind of negotiator am I? And so there's lots of great quizzes and other questionnaires to help you kind of think of it. I've offered two. This one is a what kind of negotiator am I? It's from HBR, so limited free articles. You can see what strategies you favor. And then our friend Commerce CEO Global has the neat cross-cultural negotiations quiz. I know some of you did that back in the discussion board, but if you haven't already, it's a great one to take a look at or do again. And so what kind of rules then when part of a team comes into play? So you have an idea maybe what kind of negotiator you are, but now you're part of a team. You don't have to do it all. So here's some major actions you and other negotiating teammates will likely need to do. The role of asking questions, summarizing, observing, recording, synthesizing, relationship building, smoothing over, as we'll call it. So say, when someone was upset about something or confused, someone's got to do that bridging talk. Persuasion, laying out increasing or decreasing demands or concessions. Pre-session and in between sessions, someone's got to be doing planning, researching, coordinating, figuring out roles. And of course, depending on your team, if a person leads or how people are able or willing to step in. So how or who does what? But you have to remember, a lot of this will depend on your team, organization, cultures involved. So it's not like you're working with a clean slate. There are probably established practices that you can draw on. So you'll remember that there's lots of examples where there are different norms on power distance and authority for who speaks on behalf of whom. So just because someone is the lead speaker and always the one talking in terms of questions or sharing information or proposals, it may not mean they're the lead decision maker. So a final idea to kind of think up before, and then we'll be going into our activity for the negotiation workshop, and I invite you to take a look at the page that's posted on Blackboard. So what kind of roles when part of a team can you do? So we talked about these, but now, well, how to decide what actions you'll do and when as part of a role, as a cohesive person. So here is a list of roles that show different ways you can combine different actions and timing in relation to each other. And I'm not saying to do all of them, since it of course depends on what the other negotiating team is like or what your team is like, but lots of great ideas to consider. So action off. So this one is from Mike Bosick of 2019 UN negotiator. So he recommended these type of roles. Someone might need to be an action officer, a skeptic, an optimist, a subject matter expert, a legal expert, a presenter, a fixer. So in other words, someone who can get, if negotiations need to get back on track. So maybe you're distracted or something is just a moot point, back on track, back to the core ideas. Maybe an interpreter, a lead negotiator. And so Mike describes this as a conductor. So not necessarily the person who is talking the most, but someone who's kind of helping be the it person. Next, the decision maker themselves. So I highly invite you to click here, and Mike's got a nice kind of just example of how he thinks different action steps can be made into different roles. And so again, just ideas. It's something you and your teammates have to figure out for yourselves how you want to play. And a lot of it will be that there's going to be a little bit of flexibility that'll need to take place, some playing by ear. But in the long run, it still helps a lot to kind of just think through so that you don't have to think on your feet. And if someone coughs or sneezes, or even, oh my goodness, well, we're obviously not going to do that here, but throwing a chair, hey, you've got your cool, you've got your winks or nods or quick chats or a plan to regroup, calm down, and see what's needed. Or even just, hopefully not even thrown chairs, but anything else, you will be ready. Maybe you'll have a grand opportunity and you want to kind of have an idea that maybe someone's like, hey, we can expand on this. Let's keep talking about this. Let's not just close up and go. So, with that, I hope you'll consider not only just what is your negotiating style and the styles available, but how it is you can go and make it happen. How can you think of these roles and think about what you can do to collaboratively make a good outcome. And so here are your looking back learning objectives from your book. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, louis@laverne.edu. I hope you're having a good day or evening so far. I'm looking forward to what we have to do with our negotiations activities and hope to hear from you all soon. So in the meantime, whatever ideas, take them, run with them, see where they lead you. Who knows what you might find.